The London Underground is a true pioneer. Before the Underground, the concept of a subway or metro system just didn't exist. The first line on the Underground was the Metropolitan Railway, and the first station to open on the Metropolitan Railway was Baker Street. So it's a pretty big deal. The station opened on the 10th of January 1863. The part that opened back then is now platforms 5 and 6, the Circle and Hammersmith and City platforms. The Underground is famous for the respect it pays to its heritage, but I feel like no station feels quite as Victorian as this one, despite the 1911 sign at the end. When it opened, the Metropolitan was a very different line. For one thing, it was laid to broad gauge. Now, I've talked about this in more detail in another video, which I will cause to pop up in the top right-hand corner. But, long story short, the line was originally to be operated using the Great Western Railway's rolling stock. The Great Western's track was laid to a gauge of 7 feet and 1/4 inch, so that was what Baker Street had to accommodate. Not long afterwards, the Metropolitan had a falling out with the Great Western over money and eventually wound up getting their own trains. These were still steam-powered though, and you can see the ventilation shafts on these early platforms, albeit they now house electric lights. In 2015, these platforms came at number 4 in a poll of London transport design icons. In 1868, a second station was built here, known as Baker Street East. If you know Baker Street, you may not have heard of Baker Street East, but you have almost certainly visited the site of it. It was where the other platforms used by the Metropolitan line are today. Baker Street East was not technically built by the Metropolitan Railway, but by a company called the Metropolitan and St John's Wood Railway. This was, as the name suggests, a railway linking St John's Wood with the Metropolitan Railway. It was one of those odd legal corporate things that the railways did back then. Partially owned by the Metropolitan, operated by them, but legally separate. Of course, your average passenger probably wouldn't notice any difference. And even among the staff of the Met, the Metropolitan and St John's Wood was often called the Extension Line. The Metropolitan dictated the company policy of the newer company and put great emphasis on the line because they saw it as the key to bringing in new traffic from the suburbs. In 1882, the older company officially took the Metropolitan and St John's Wood over, by which time Harrow-on-the-Hill had been reached. There is a connection between the two lines at Baker Street, but weirdly enough, from 1869 to 1907, this was not used. In 1906, the Baker Street and Waterloo Railway arrived, or, as it's known today, the Bakerloo Line. This was originally in a separate station on Baker Street before the whole lot was rebuilt in the 1920s, of which more later. Actually, the line terminated here until March the following year, when it extended to the station we now know as Marylebone. And it was perhaps inevitable that a certain famous fictional detective would crop up at some point in this video. Sherlock Holmes is commemorated on the Bakerloo platforms with a motif of silhouettes that were installed in the 1980s. I'm going to step away from trains for a moment, God help us, to talk about the rebuild in the 1920s. Now, the Metropolitan Railway wasn't just in the business of running trains, but also property development. This was due to a loophole that allowed them to have more land than they needed to build their railway. They marketed this under the name of Metroland. People typically think of Metroland as being small towns and suburbs out in Middlesex and Buckinghamshire, places like Amersham, Harrow, Pinner, and other towns that I should really think about doing videos on. But there was a little bit of Metroland on Baker Street too, in the form of Chiltern Court. This was a block of flats and shops built on top of the station, proposed in 1925 and opening in 1929. The station as a whole was being rebuilt to make everything a little bit less messy, and though nobody seems to have said as much, to turn Baker Street into a fitting headquarters for an important railway. The Metropolitan generally considered themselves a cut above the other underground lines. The block was designed by the company architect Charles W. Clark. Residents included writers H. G. Wells and Arnold Bennett, cartoonist David Lowe, and graphic designer Edward McKnight Kauffer. It was very much sold as a luxury development for well-off and important people, a city pied-à-terre with easy access to both the heart of London and the Chiltern countryside. It was a neat little money spinner for the railway company. A flat there now will set you back the thick end of £2 million. If you don't have £2 million to spare, say you're a YouTuber who makes videos about trains or something, the old Chiltern Court restaurant is now the Metropolitan Bar, which you can of course visit. Incidentally, one of the last goods services on the Underground was the rubbish collection from Chiltern Court, consisting of a locomotive, a single wagon and a brake van. You know you're rich when your bin has its own train service. In 1979, the Jubilee Line came to Baker Street, although in a sense it had already been there for quite a while. In 1939, a new branch of the Bakerloo Line opened, which ran from Baker Street to Finchley Road. From Finchley Road, it took over the Metropolitan Line's services to Stanmore. The point of this was to relieve congestion on the Metropolitan, something that had been badly needed for decades. In 1979, the Jubilee Line arrived. While the section from Baker Street to Charing Cross would be newly built, the section from Baker Street to Stanmore would take over the Bakerloo Line branch. Being the first underground station, Baker Street has often found itself pressed into service for administrative purposes. In the years after Chiltern Court Restaurant closed, but before it was a Wetherspoons, job interviews for prospective underground staff were held there. Until 2019, it was the home of the Lost Property Department, which has since moved to South Kensington. These days, Baker Street has the highest number of platforms of any underground station at 10. There are many stations that have more platforms overall, but Baker Street has the most tube platforms. It retains many of its heritage features thanks to a sympathetic restoration in the 80s, and it's almost an attraction in its own right. It's strange to think, when you look at the hundreds of metro systems all around the world, from Glasgow to Moscow, from New York to Naples, from Paris to Pyongyang, it all began with this one station. Hello all, I hope you enjoyed this premiere tale from the tube. If you did, a like would be much appreciated, and if you'd like to know what followed this station, consider subscribing for many, many more underground videos. Thanks as always to my donors on Ko-fi and Patreon. You are the Metropolitan and St John's Wood Railway to my Metropolitan Railway. And I'll see you all again very soon for another tale from the tube.